Basically, I have 36 years of motorcycle transmission experience, and I had 10 years experience before I opened my own shop doing nothing but motorcycle transmissions. So we're all trained professionals, and this is all we do. We do nothing but motorcycle transmission. Well, basically, I started out with cars. Basically, I had an engine built in my cellar of my house up north. I had a small block Chevy built before I even had a car to put it in when I was 15. Built a couple different cars, saw a Z1 Kawasaki do a burnout in the 7-Eleven parking lot, and knew I had to have one. Instantly became friends with the guy, rode around with him on it, and knew I had to have one. So in '76, I bought a KZ 900 LTD. Ended up moving from Massachusetts down here to Florida. Went to a vocational school, Shawsheen Valley Regional Vocational Technical High School. It was an elite school where they had all the state-of-the-art equipment in there. So we had a full machine shop, heat treat facility, everything. That's where I got my start. I worked at a place called Technical Operation. I worked in Radiation Products Division, and we made gamma ray projectors, take x-rays of welds and sorts like that. I moved down here to Florida, got a job at a place making mortar loaders for the government, which was pretty boring, making parts to a print. Started getting involved in racing my Kawasaki. Started hanging out at the Kawasaki shop. Ended up going to work for them part-time, doing machining pistons, drilling disc brakes, things like that. Didn't quite know why I was doing it, but I could take instruction and do it. And then after some time working there, I went to work there full-time. Went to Kawasaki school in Atlanta. Been everything from a line mechanic to a parts manager to a service manager. Did that for probably 4 years or so. Went to work for Murdoch Racing in 1980, and Mike Murdoch had invented the air shifter, and to save Mike Murdoch from getting killed, we had to come up with a solution to make these bikes shift, because transmissions that didn't have any undercut on them would not shift with an air shifter properly. So that's when we started undercutting gears. I went to work for them, and they were doing stuff by hand with die grinders and whatnot. And there was a complete machine shop sitting there idle. And I designed some dovetail carbide end mills. And then we started machining them in a rotary table and a milling machine. And I worked there for 10 years. And when I left, I almost went to work for Star Racing up in Georgia, but decided to open my own shop. And I raced, I had a altered Kawasaki back in the 80s, raced a little bit in IDBA. Got to the point where Murdoch didn't want me racing anymore because he didn't want to, I guess, jeopardize his cash cow. Ended up selling the bike and getting out of racing, just fully concentrating my efforts on motorcycle transmissions. Yeah, it was costume jewelry on wheels, and basically at that time they were selling for more money. There was a 2-year waiting period, and I had been doing transmissions for Tommy Hannum at Hannum's Harley Davidson up in Pennsylvania, and I had been doing his drag bike trannies on his Sportster. Basically, every time I got through talking to him on the phone, he would be like, "Man, is there anything I can ever do for you? You just let me know." And one day I hung the phone up after talking to him and said, maybe there is something he could do. So I picked the phone back up and said, "Hey, Tommy, what's the weight on a Heritage Softail Special?" He goes, 2 years. I said, "Oh." And he goes, "But for you?" "Probably 2 months. And I said, "Okay." And he sold it to me for what MSRP was, which was $14,800 back then. Did a few mods to it, put some Screaming Eagle slip-ons on it, put a Dyna ignition in it, put a Can-N air cleaner dyno jet kit in it. Sold it a year and a half later for $17,800. So it was at the time, told my wife, I said, look, I could put money in the stock market, or I could buy a Harley and know I can make some money on it. So that's what I did. Some of the shops are closed-minded to having anything done outside of their shop. And they have the thought in mind that whatever their brand is, that it's infallible. Right. That whatever their manufacturer makes is infallible. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's all your fault. That's not the case. Right. We see in transmissions, we can see where engineers paint themselves into a corner and then just leave themselves there. And they create problems. I have a firm belief that any engineer out there that designs something should have to take it apart and put it back together again. Because if he did, he'd go back to the drawing board. I first started doing Harley transmissions back in the 80s when I was working at Murdoch Racing. local Harley, actually a Harley over in Tampa, had a drag bike, and they were having issues with it shifting, particularly fourth gear. And they brought the transmission by, and I never worked on a Harley transmission before that. But, we looked at it, and what Harley had done was their very early 5-speeds, we call them dog monsters. And what that is that the dogs on the transmission were very long on the circle. You have a circle, you have 5 dogs on there, and you have a gap in between each of those dogs. The distance between those dogs is what we call drop-in time. And if you were to take a set of gears, the 2 mating gears, and you just took them in your hands, and you turned it till the dogs touched the XL side, and then you turn it clockwise and turn it counterclockwise. That amount of gap in there is what we call drop-in time. Now, the more drop-in time you have, the quicker the bike will shift, because it can find that gap sooner. The early Harleys, like I said, the very early ones, the dogs were very, very big, and all of them were very big, and they didn't shift worth of beans. So Harley went ahead and they decreased the size of the dog on the circle on first gear, second gear, and third gear. But they left fourth gear and fifth gear with large dogs and not much drop-in area. And my thought is they were thinking that when you were double up with the old lady on the back of the bike so that when you were on and off the gas, you would have less backlash. But it creates a problem in that when you try to shift one fast, it can't find that gap. So when we looked at that first Harley that we worked on, we realized that although they had decreased the dog size on the previous gears, fourth and fifth were left with bigger dogs and bigger and smaller engagement area. We had seen this on the Kawasaki's. The Kawasaki's had a fourth gear issue that we would machine the dogs and give them more drop-in time. So when we saw the Harley, we could tell what was going on. We machined the dogs back and put a good undercut on there for the guys, and lo and behold, it worked great. So word kind of spread there, and then we started doing more Harley transmissions. The Harley transmission, Harley's premise of operation, it's a little bit different than any other motorcycle manufacturer. All of your Japanese motorcycles, your Italian motorcycles, your English motorcycles, they all put themselves into gear 3/4 of the way, 7/8 of the way into gear. Harley's thought, and this is prior to, say, the V-Rod or the new Type 6-speed, but all of their 5-speeds and their 4-speeds, they would put themselves into gear halfway, and Harley was okay with that, and it even will tell you that in the manual. That's okay for Joe average street bike, but when you're starting to make some horsepower, you need more static engagement than halfway. And what Harley does, and again, this is like no other manufacturer, they machine the slots, in the shift drum. Like on a 5-speed, you've got a 1/4 inch pin in the shift fork that rides in the slot in the drum. And the slots in the drum are just a little bit bigger than that 1/4 inch, except when you get to the engagement point. And what they do there is the slot gets wider. The slot will get wider out to about maybe 5/16 of an inch, so that if you were to take the lid off of your 5-speed and you were to shift it into a gear and you reached in and grabbed the shift fork, you could put that into gear all the way by pushing the shift fork over. But if you push it back against the engagement peak and see how little engagement you have, that's actually what you're going to have. And so the idea there is that you really want to get more engagement than what Harley has to offer. There are aftermarket shift drums out there, but all of these guys are a bunch of copycats, and they make their drum. They might change the detent profile and make it more modern. The earlier detent profiles on the early Harleys were more like a flower petal than a star. You want a detent to be like a star. You don't want to be able to position the shift drum halfway between gear and have it stay there. It needs to be on one side or the other. So the early drums, they were a little bit lacking as far as detent profile goes. But again, all of the aftermarket drums are plotted off of the same positioning like the stock Harley drum, and they do the same thing with their engagement areas. If they wanted to make a shift drum that was better, they should extend the peak on the drum and put it into gear farther. But again, nobody does. What we do when we build a Harley box, usually the best way to do it is to send us the entire, like say 5-speed Sportster or Big Twin. And on the Big Twins, we'll pull the lid and we will look inside. We'll put it into every gear and we will check and see how much engagement it has. Then we will take and make our notes as to how much engagement it has. Then we will disassemble the transmission, actually pull the gear cluster out on the door, and then we'll take a feeler blade and check all the side play of all those gears in there. Then we will sit down and figure out how much we want to move the gears over and how much slop we want to take out. And so we will come up with a shimming configuration to actually tighten the gears and move them over to get more engagement. All the Harley shims are 70 thousandths thick from the factory. There are no other Harley shims available. They just use a standard shim, and that's what you get. So we have shims of different thicknesses that we will use to move the gears to get more engagement. We like to see at least 3/4 of the depth, but most of the time we'll get you 7/8 or better. And that way you get more engagement, and we undercut the gears so that they'll pull themselves in. On the 4th and the 5th gear sets, we reduce the dog area so that you have more drop-in time. Once we're done with it, we undercut it, we shim it. They'll shift like no Harley shifts. I mean, we've done them for guys that have had sport bikes and Harleys, and guys say my Harley shifts better than my GSXR does now. Once we're through with them, Sportsters, it's kind of the same thing. It's all on the door, so you basically have everything on the door. We have a plate that we put on the other side that replicates it being inside of the case, so we can again see what's going on there. The situation with the Sportster is very similar to what it is with the 5-speed Big Twin. One thing in particular that the Sportster has, they have two things that are problematic with them. The shift forks encompass the shift drum. In other words, the shift forks, they have a cylindrical bore in them where they slide right over the shift drum, where the 5-speed Big Twins, the forks ride on a fork rod. They do not encompass the drum. The problem with the Sportster is that there's only 4 thousandths clearance between the shift fork inside diameter, where it rides on the drum, and then the outside diameter of the shift drum. There's only 4 thousandths clearance in there. Harley failed to deburr the engagement slots in the shift drum. The slots are so sharp, even only being at a 90-degree angle, they are still so sharp you could cut yourself on them. And what happens is that on the Sportster, the shift fork pins are only 3/16 of an inch in diameter. So when that pin hits the side of the slot in the drum, it can raise a burr up. Now, with only 4 thousandths clearance in there, it doesn't take much of a burr to cause that fork to bind on the drum. Once that fork pin has hit the side of the slot in the drum and raises that burr, you're going to feel that burr in every shift, because the shift drum has to turn inside of that fork to get into any other gear. So say you raise a burr up on 2nd gear, and it happens when you're getting into 2nd gear. But after that, that drum still has to rotate inside of that fork. Not that that fork is going anywhere, but the burr is still in there. And so the drum rotates inside that fork even when you're shifting 3rd gear, 4th gear, 5th gear. So once that burr is in there, it's going to hinder shifting in all gears. And what we do there is we chamfer the slots in the shift drum. We relieve the hole in the shift fork where the pin goes through. Then we polish the shift drum so that it rotates smoothly in there. The other problem with that Sportster 5-speed shift drum is that the pins on the shift drum on the end where the detent star is, they're a press fit into the drum. They have an installed height. They don't go in and bottom. They have an installed height. And what happens is, under hard shifting, these pins will work their way out. Now, the detent plate is held onto the end of the shift drum over the pins that the shifter actually rotates. And it's held in place by this wavy thrust circlip thing. I don't even know what you call it. I've never ever seen one used in any other kind of manufacturing of anything before, but it does not hold the plate tight, does not hold it rigid. You can actually rock the detent plate around. A detent should be fixed and firm. So what happens is these pins will walk out of the shift drum, and they will cause the detent plate to get cocked, and it will cock so far that the back of the clutch basket can actually rub that detent star. And what we do in that respect is that we take the shift drum and we reinstall the pins to their installed height. Then we turn the end of the shift drum down where the wavy thrust circlip thing used to go, and we turn it down and we thread it. And then we counterbore the plate and we put a nylock nut on there so that it holds that detent plate firm, holds the shift drum plate, the detent plate, in position, and also keeps those pins from walking themselves out of the shift drum. So that's one thing that's particular to the Sportster, as well as the undercutting and the shimming that we do. It greatly improves the shifting of the Sportsters and the big twins and makes them last so much longer. The other thing with the Harley transmissions is a lot of people don't understand how you figure the actual gear ratios on a Harley. But basically what you do to figure your ratios is you take your countershaft gear and you take that and divide it by your main shaft gear, and that gives you your raw ratio. Everything runs through the fifth gear set. Now your fifth gear set has a multiplication ratio because everything runs through it. Now no matter what the high gear tooth count is, it's always going to be 1-to-1 on a Harley because it's divided by itself and it's multiplied by itself. So fifth gear is always 1-to-1. But the ratio changes become greater in first gear because its gear ratio number is higher than any other one. So when you change the multiplication ratio of the fifth gear set, it changes the low gear the most. For example, a Sportster transmission is listed as a 278 low gear. All Sportster 5-speeds have the exact same part number first gear. And even in the early pre-high contact gearboxes prior to 94, they still had the same first gear. In 94, they changed the tooth pitch on all of the gears except for first gear. And they changed the main drive gear. Now, the early main drive gear had a 1.73 multiplication ratio. The later one had a 1.68 multiplication ratio. So the low gear gets multiplied by the high gear to give you what your actual number is. So the exact same low gear in an early Harley is a 278. Because of that 1.73 multiplication ratio. But the later one, having a 1.68 multiplication ratio, actually changes that same first gear to being a 268 first gear, or close to 269. So, as Andrews lists in their catalog, a 261 low gear for all Sportsters. It's only a 261 low gear prior to 1994. After 1994, it's actually a 252 low gear. Only because that multiplication ratio changes. And the ratios on the early Sportsters all the way up until 99, their RPM drops were not decremental, and meaning that you had as much RPM drop from first to second as you did second to third. You really want your RPM ratios to be decremental, meaning you want the most amount of drop from first to second and then decreasing from there, because the engine cannot recover due to the taller ratios of the next gear as well as it can in the lower gears. So that's why the lower gears have the most RPM drop, and then you take RPM drop away the farther down the track you go. And so the early Sportsters, basically we call them square ratios because the RPM drop from first to second and second to third was basically about the same. And they changed that in 2000 when they changed the second gear ratio so that the RPM drops are more decremental. You have your most drop from first to second, and then you have less from second to third. The performance ratios of that 2000 set were much better. I think the early ones, they pretty much did it the way that they did it because second gear counter and third gear main were the same gear, and third counter and second main were the same gear. So it made it idiot proof. You could put the gears on there and you couldn't mix them up. Where you put them didn't matter. With the new set, You could put second gear where third gear goes and third gear where second gear goes, which would totally screw up your RPM drops. It would still shift, but it would be a dog. So I think they did that for two reasons. One, to make it idiot-proof. One, to make it so that they didn't have to stock as many different parts. But the ratios of the 2000 up are much better for performance as far as the Sportsters go. Most people, when they call us, they can just tell us what motorcycle that they have.
Right.
And we can pretty much tell them what their problem is before they even explain what their situation is. Because we have so much knowledge in motorcycle transmissions that, for one, you could send us a brand new transmission out of a brand new model bike that had never even been started and driven. And we can look at that, and with our vast experience and knowledge and knowing what we know, and seeing what we've seen, and seeing the problems that arise from different manufacturers and different designs, we can look at that and tell you what problems you're going to have before you even experience them. Because we've been doing this so long and we know what problems are going to arise, we can foreshadow what's going to happen with that brand new thing, brand new transmission, before you even start that bike. We know about all different modifications that we do, the circlip modifications and stuff, because we've seen failures in the past. We've seen bushing failures and things like that, and we have upgrades for certain bikes where they have bushing failures. We have certain upgrades where they have circlip failures. We do heat treating on gears that they have a lack of structural integrity. We do cryogenics on some stuff that has a problem with, say, integrity of the steel. So we basically, we do just basic undercutting, but we specialize in not only diagnosing your problem, but realizing what problems you're going to have before you even know you're going to have them. Give us a call. Telephone number is 727-447-4552. My name is Mark, and I will answer the phone and talk to you.